And all of you probably know Donatien Grau as a scholar and a writer, but perhaps it's less known that he's very well informed about the art of Los Angeles, which is where I met him several years ago when I was writing the chronology for a book on the LA artist Richard Jackson. I basically stole some ideas from you, but at least I credited that. And Donatien knew Richard well and has also written about other Los Angeles mainstay artists like Larry Pittman, and he's a great friend of Paul McCarthy, and Francis Stark, Sam Falls. You've written...
And recently Chris Burden, because I just did the book of Chris's unrealized projects.
So I had my sort of personal reasons for wanting to talk to Donatien because he's literally a generation younger than I. And I knew all these guys. All the War Babies and the Studs I was acquainted with, and I continue to know Ed Ruscha and Billy Al and all of them in my old age, because they are also, they're even older than I am. They're in their 80s. Donatien, however, knows sort of a different and younger crowd. And this is what I wanted him to talk about. I wanted him to bring Los Angeles of the 60s and its early 70s and connect it to late till 70s and 80s at least, which you can easily do, and up to the 90s even.
That's an audacious gesture. Well, thank you, Dagny. I'm really pleased to be here. I must say, I'm very humbled because everybody knows that the greatest luminaries have been in conversation with Dagny. So I feel extremely intimidated being here with you right now. And it's true that we know very few people who have had these close connection to artists, which you've had for decades now, because you are at the same time, because of your position with books at LACMA, you're at the same time a little bit on the side. You're not a dealer, you're not a curator, but at the same time you deal with things that artists are passionate about. So it's been fascinating having all these conversations with artists that connect with you, that are amazed with you. And in a way, when I see you, I see this sort of extraordinary breed of the great Californian lady who could, have the greatest conversation over a vodka tonic at noon. And you can do that, and I completely admire it. And so, but at the same time, the fact that you have these extraordinary acquaintances with artists and creatives and curators and dealers and institutions, in a way means that you can look at things in different ways. And when you invited me to first come to this, I was interested because having spent a lot of time at the Getty on the Hill when the Getty was working on its Pacific Standard Time project, these two shows, especially this one, played a major part in it. As in terms of trying to unravel the fact that Los Angeles was not just the heterosexual boys club that was known as in the 80s and 90s, that actually was a much more complex and layered history. And in a way, these two shows and their tensions play a big role in it. And then I was also very interested in the fact that, I came to Los Angeles, as quite a few of you know, because I happened to meet artists, and each artist introduced me to another artist. And then I sort of came to discover that they loved each other, hated each other, loved each other and hated each other at the same time. And that was mostly the world of LA in the 80s and 90s. I came to be acquainted to, whether it was Paul McCarthy, to whom indeed I am very close, as well as Larry Pittman or Charlie Ray or Chris Burden. I just conceived this book that just came out that is the sort of overview of all his unrealized projects, which is extraordinary. I was literally one of the last people who went to visit Chris, and he showed me all these stacks of unrealized projects. And then after he died, I had a conversation, and then I said, we have to do this. And then, it ended up happening just now. So anyway, I was sort of, and then I saw that, and then I thought, LA as any city, but especially a city with history, art history is so short. Now think about this, we talk about LA art, we're talking about something that is 50 years of history, really, 60 maybe now, 60. And so even though it's much more complex, but still it's very, very short. And so I was thinking about it, and then I thought, okay, there's this extraordinary way that LA covers the city, which is happening now, by the way. There's a completely new generation arriving in LA or living in LA of artists who bring together commerce, and culture and industry. There's also a world discussion on representation that is now very important in LA and allows us to reread history and really emphasize the role of extraordinarily important artists, like, for example, Charles Gaines was Barbara Smith in a different way, were from different generations, played a major role that wasn't public. So in a way, it was very interesting to see, as we now see a history, the sort of helter-skelter history based on that very important show that Paul Schimmel did in 1995, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that kind of prompted a completely new way of looking at LA. And then now this generation is sort of being handed over to a new world. And so I was interested in that. And when I saw this, I was very interested in it as well, because it was another layer of LA history that had been overlayered, basically, and that you could see that this was a huge scandal when it happened. It was also fascinating to see that you could, in 1961, by the way, is the year LACMA opens. So it's also, 1961, the War Babies show, the year LACMA opens. 1964, the Studs is the year David Hockney arrives in LA.
And my point, you're coming at it as a historian. My point was actually to introduce the fact that Los Angeles in the 60s actually did have a history. And it starts with this War Babies show. This poster, that's the original poster, which is so cool. But the War Babies were all born in the late 30s. And they were all very much influenced by the World War II. And the way Americans perceived the war is substantially different from the way Europeans did, because we were in America. And so when these four artist friends got together, the show was held at a gallery called Weissman's Gallery, which had nothing to do with Weissman's. It was meant to be Weissman's, the great collectors in Los Angeles. But they just mispronounced it, and so it became Weissman's Gallery. It was done by Henry Hopkins, who was a well-known curator and was the director, finally, of the San Francisco Art Museum. But Joe Good conceived this poster, and he and his pals, Ed Burrell, Larry Bell, that's Joe, and Ron Miyashiro, were just goofing off, and they had no idea they were going to be so provocative. But they used these sort of cultural stereotypes. Ed, the black guy, is eating a watermelon. Larry, the Jew, is eating a matzo ball. The Catholic Joe Good has some mackerel, and Ron Miyashiro has chopsticks.
And the eating of an American flag.
Right, covered with cigarette butts, and needless to say, this was the middle of the McCarthy era and very conservative American politics. And it just flew in the face of everybody, and everybody went berserk. All of the Weissman Gallery backers pulled out, and the gallery closed within 4 more months. So that whole War Babies just provoked this incredible reaction. So my idea, I wanted to start here. Donatien knows as much as I do about the history of it. But I wanted to start here and present the war babies, which are along that wall. The other thing that's interesting is that none of these guys, Larry Bell is still alive, Joe Good's still alive, Ed Ruscha, none of them have any idea what they had in that show. And I went through all the Getty archives, I went everywhere to find just any hint, but they just don't remember. So what I luckily did was I was able to find works of art from a similar period. At the end, the cube with the mirrored cube is Larry Bell. That's an early piece by him, and just when he was beginning to work with this idea of three-dimensional cubes on a flat surface. That piece is actually just laid on a canvas. It's not three-dimensional at all. Then Ed Burrell is an artist who was long overlooked when he was making works. His work often refers to the Second World War, and the works he was making in the 60s had a lot of reference to Nazi symbols. And if you look closely into that painting there, you'll see an almost invisible swastika. Many of his pieces were much more aggressive and assertive. They were like bags of stuff that were marked with really obvious swastikas. And he made these sort of heavy and aggressive works, but for some reason he was also a very fine draftsman. And those are self-portraits, the graphite work there, that he was able to do. What I need to also say is that every single one of these people studied under Robert Irwin, the conceptual artist who was teaching at Chouinard, and he also taught at UCLA. And all these artists made the effort to go and work with Bob. Bob was about 10 years older, and interestingly, Ron Miyashiro was born, he's Asian American, but he was born in Hawaii. Before Hawaii was a state, and because he was Asian and because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he was interred. And he and all of his relatives and friends were separated from the rest of the community because of the war. So both Ron and Ed Burrell have this overriding memory of German power, and they both refer to the fact that they were very influenced by Life and Look magazine and the images they saw in those magazines. Of course, they never actually saw. I mean, Ron Miyashiro has stated that he saw the warplanes in Hawaii, but he was not particularly political until he realized that he was Asian, and he had to he couldn't interact with the rest of the so-called Americans. It's also the reason I put Via Selmans in the show. She's in the other room, because Via, although she was born in Latvia, was working exactly at the same time, was in Los Angeles at the same time, and also was quite influenced by World War II and the sort of bombers and the German airplanes that, again, she saw in Life magazine. And she's done huge paintings of German warplanes that have swastikas on them. So these so-called war babies that's the pinpoint and sort of the what would you say, the generational difference that they were affected by the war in a really serious way.
But the war had a big impact on the LA world. I mean, if you look at it, Adorno goes to LA, Christopher Isherwood goes to LA, B.D. Wilder goes to LA. So all those generations of people ended up there, and they were to make the intellectual world of sort of create the basis for what was going to be.
Especially the literary world.
Exactly, and then even and then you can see artists who are born a little bit later than the war babies, but say Paul McCarthy or Chris Burden,
Right.
who consistently tackled World War II. Chris Burden made a number of works that directly address bombing, bombers, Europe, Germany, and as you probably know, Chris Burden, although going to LA, in the late 60s, early 70s, and becoming a sort of landmark LA artist, grew up in Paris. He spoke fluent French, as some of you know. And in the same way, Paul McCarthy has consistently returned to sort of living memory of World War II. So what's really interesting is it sort of tackles this complicated relation that LA had to World War II, especially since here there's something further, which is that World War II had a huge impact in the U.S. as far as engagement of community, sort of as far as it was concerned. Of course, Asian American were placed in camps, while African Americans also fought during the war and therefore gave blood for this political cause. So what's extraordinary is that this war, which had an effect both of separating and bringing together, is assembled, so to speak, in that image, which is still today extraordinarily striking.
It's pretty shocking.
Yeah.
I love the idea that although the poster was made in '61, if you look at it, it could be made yesterday. It's simply provocative and very, very interesting.
But it's also interesting because again, it sort of signifies a sort of coexistence of origins and cultures, which are completely caricatural, of course. But at the same time, it's something that wasn't that present, in the LA art world, that people from different culture could make work together, be together. Still today, there isn't an Asian American Chris Burden. There is something quite specific to that, the way it evolved, which.
Do you think that it was the Vietnam War that sort of united everybody more than World War II?
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's a different thing because the memory of World War II remained present for a number of artists, while the Vietnam War was a struggle. They were fighting against.
Actually in.
Yeah, exactly. But in a way, I think that paradoxically, the memory, once you pass this threshold of the end of the Vietnam War, well, the memory of World War II stayed much longer in a much stronger way in the work of certain artists, like, again, Burden or McCarthy.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you can find other examples for whom World War II remained, as it was, Paul McCarthy is currently making works addressing Hitler.
Yeah.
Now,
right.
And we are in 2022. So he's not making a work addressing World War II. Maybe because, of course, there are different issues related to each war. One in which American, of course, played the more or less good part, more or less, and the other where it did not. And what you were saying, which I think was very interesting, the fact that they had seen images of the war, but they hadn't actually witnessed it.
Yeah,
that was really important. And so it is a memory that is culturally extremely important, but that hasn't been experienced.
Yes, exactly.
While the Vietnam War was.
Right.
I mean,
and it was also the Vietnam War. Another sort of war, if you will, that triggered a lot was the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965, and that turned around Ed Burrell. Ed was, up until then, he was showing at the Weissman's Gallery. He was participating in a lot of shows, but at the time of the Watts riots, he sort of personally was hugely affected by his community.
But he lived next door to the riots, right?
Yeah, he was right there. And he was in danger, physical danger, because of the guns, the bullets. And so he stopped. He stopped painting. He was very put off by the art world's reaction to the way the Watts riots. It sort of was like business as usual. It's like, oh, geez, that's too bad. It was over in a week, and the art world in LA at 65 just sort of were horrified by the riots, but did not change anything. And it affected him so much that he stopped painting, and he started this wild street theater, this guerrilla theater in Los Angeles called the Bodacious Boogerilla. And they would perform. It was a totally black group. It was not, they weren't interested in involving themselves or having an interchange with whites at all. But the Bodacious Boogerilla were very political, and they performed everywhere. They performed in laundromats. They performed in churches, anywhere they could. It was a kind of a street theater. And they were effective. All the white people and all the art collectors were scared of them. But the community in general, they had this program of bringing in black youth and teaching them how to get jobs and giving them jobs, because they often would film their performances, and they'd have these young kids learn how to be videographers, how to actually get jobs and be involved in the community. And it wasn't until, when was Ed's show?
Which, 2 years ago, right?
Yeah, it really wasn't until the mid-'80s that Ed started painting again. And his paintings after the Watts riots, and when he stopped painting for many years, when he started painting again, the works were entirely different from the early pieces, and they were more overtly political criticism, rather than this kind of abstract, more thoughtful pieces.
But it's interesting because if you look at the way, again, talking about the way art history is written in LA, or not written, I mean, people like Roland Miyashiro, Ed Burrell, they're not at the center of the narrative of LA art. Part of it is, of course, that in the case of Ed Burrell, 1965, he's so shocked by the Watts riots that he goes on and does something else. And it was really only until less than a decade ago then their role was really reappraised. I think the Pacific Standard Time program of the Getty,
made a huge difference,
which looked into the history of those shows, and especially this show, and then wanted to look into the relation of LA art to Latin America, to Asia, to different parts of the various communities, allowed to look into their work, which, the art in LA of the 60s is a very difficult thing to map, because there are so many different aspects that are burgeoning, really.
And completely different from each other.
Exactly. And it is the beginning of so many things, because really in the 60s, you don't have that much.
But on the other hand, you have the so-called studs.
Yeah.
The Huysmans Gallery was on La Cienega, and the Ferris Gallery was across the street.
Yeah.
And they had an entirely different mindset, these artists. The studs were apolitical, and they were charming, and they made work because they were surfers. And so Billy Al, for example, he was also a motorcycle enthusiast. And so his big innovation was to make paintings that he called dentos, which, like the yellow one, are made out of the same metal that motorcycle gas tanks are made out of. And he was an expert spray painter, because that's what he did. He made surfboards and painted gas tanks. And then, of course, because he was Billy Al, he smashed the aluminum pieces with a hammer to bang them up, refer to the motorcycle crashes and excitement that he had. He actually, though, I mean, God bless him, is totally charming. And everybody loved him, and including Judy Chicago, who was just followed him around. But what he did and what he influenced her primarily was she went out and learned how to spray paint. Thanks to Billy, he kind of mentored her a little bit and took her to the spray paint place, and she learned how to do it. And of course, Billy Al takes complete credit for her work, but in fact, it was her. She was called Judy Garowitz at the time, and she only changed her name later. She'd already had a show at the Pasadena Art Museum, just like Bob Irwin, but nobody remembers Judy Garowitz at the Pasadena Art Museum. And that's another point I wanted to make, and Donasian can do it better. There were women around, and they were working simultaneously, and they were good. I'm talking, really, there was Mary Korsh, there was Barbara Smith, there was Via Selmans, there was Helen Pashkin. There were very, very strong artists making strong
and strong dealers.
And that's right. That's right. You remind me. The dealers were women, right?
And there were, Eugenia Butler, Virginia Dwan. I mean, Eugenia Butler was an extraordinary character. She was an eccentric. She gave Joseph Kosuth his first show. She showed Larry Bell. She showed Larry Bell. She also was a great patron of the designer Rudi Gernreich, Austrian Jewish designer who came to the United States and transformed American fashion while she was his model, and she was sort of aboard these extraordinary eccentric.
You remind me again.
Dresses.
Riko Mizuno.
Yeah.
Another an Asian woman who has steadfastly refused to learn English. It's so great because she understands it perfectly, but she speaks with an extremely hard to understand Japanese accent, and that's her strength. She just, and everybody showed with Riko. So we have three really fine women art dealers in the 60s, and we have a lot of women artists that basically there's no real record of it now yet. It's coming.
It's starting to come, but there's been a great challenge to write that history. It was very interesting for me because I ended up working on the memoir of Barbara T. Smith.
Oh God, yeah, that's a story.
And and it was fascinating because over the years, she had been writing all those diary notes as well as performances statements and so on and so forth. And it was very difficult for her to write this history. And she did not only recently, and again, that's the Getty, which bought an archive and said we have to start writing a record of that. And she is an extraordinarily important figure in performance art, from the late 60s. I think her earliest performances are 68 and 69. And then until the 70s with some very famous performances like Birthdays or D-A-Z-E or Feed Me, which is a super legendary performance. And so it's interesting to see, and she, what you were talking about in terms of Judy Chicago and Banks is also something that is true of Barbara Smith and Capro, because Capro was very close to Barbara Smith, and in a way she followed a number of courses with her. It was a huge influence on her. But then that history of how they related and how she reinvented something completely different, which was radical art as life, radical performance from the point of view of a woman, was pushing all boundaries because she was married to, I think, somebody in the military, and she broke up, went with a biker, started making crazy performances, and inventing an extraordinary language. And it was extraordinary because it's the life of a woman, it's the life of a radical woman, it's the life of a radical woman as art, and it is a connection between all those layers. And that history has not yet been completely written.
Mary Kelly.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So when you think about it, the show that we're presenting here now is, you cannot even call it an overview of Los Angeles in the 60s. This is a tiny segment of what was happening. It was these two sort of notorious and provocative shows, but it really has nothing to do with the simultaneous history. Bruce Nauman was working at the same time, and Paul McCarthy's only 10 years younger.
Yeah,
he's not. They all knew each other. They were all, I said before, highly influenced by Bob Irwin.
Yeah.
And the Ed Ruscha, who was very, very involved and close friends with all of them as well. The only reason he was supposed to be a war baby, but the only reason he wasn't in the show was because he had come to Europe. And again, it was Paris that was of interest to a lot of these guys. They wanted to come. Every American wants to come to Paris anyway, but they did want to come and have that experience, and not just James Baldwin style. They wanted to. They were younger, and they just wanted to be outside of the LA community was so different from here. But Ed Ruscha did a lot of work. We're sitting in front of this funny piece. He did these portfolios of prints that he saw as single works of art. Sort of, he did not want the prints to be separated and sold individually. That he saw it as an experience of art. He did, prior to this one, he did one, and again, this is part of his important use of language. He did these kind of experimental works with rhymed titles. So this one is called, what is it called? Pew's Muse. Pew's Muse, whatever. They rhyme, but they don't make sense together. The words are not connected in any way. They're just Ed experiencing with type and experiencing how words could be presented outside of their normal context. And he did another one called Sweets, Meats, and Treats, which, again, it's this sort of rhyming titles that don't have any sense together. This piece is he uses what he calls organic material to make the colors, and that's the first question everybody asks me. What are they made out of? How did he get to those colors? So I wrote it down. I have to read it to you because I can't remember it. But so the screen stencils are made. The organic material is for news. It's black currant preserves and salmon roe. For Muse is raw eggs and fruit pie filling and pasta sauce. Pew's is chocolate syrup, coffee, and squid ink. Bru's is axle grease and caviar. Stew's is baked beans, strawberries, tomato paste, and crushed daffodils. Let's see. And Stew's also has some chutney and cherry pie filling in it. And Du's is made out of pickles. And Ed is kind of funny because he's an artist and because he is making these colors that don't exist, he notes his trials and errors. And he says, carnations did not pull. The paste separated from the liquid. Certain brands of mustard turned to dust, and chicory syrup similarly. A cream was not very satisfactory because it left a slimy deposit, and tomato paste dries to gray dust. So that's the suite of prints here is a big experiment, and it was an incredible flop when it was first offered. It was done by a publisher in England called Electa. They had invited him to do this suite of prints, and not one of them sold. And it's only now that the portfolio ranks among the most innovative of what he's done. But I guess it's nice to know that it could be a failure and then a success.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting also with this gathering of works is sort of all the histories that are here, that are present, sort of signaled but not directly manifested. I mean, the Ferus Gallery was, of course, co-founded by Kienholz.
That's right.
And Kienholz is such a major figure of LA art, of assemblage, of creating these installations. Probably he was a practicing artist and one of the most important ones working at the time.
You know, I was one of his models.
You were also a model too for David Hockney. For whom haven't you been a model? But it's part of your legend. Then also the Ferus Gallery. I think between both shows, 61 and 64, in 1962, there was a famous show of Andy Warhol where he first showed the Brillo boxes. And then, of course, the Ferus Gallery was co-run by Walter Hopps, who ended up doing the first major retrospective of Marcel Duchamp at the Pasadena Art Museum. So there are all these layered histories of LA in the 60s, which is Duchamp, which is, Kienholz, Naumann.
Duchamp actually was a huge influence because of that show.
Yeah.
Walter, sorry, here goes my voice. Walter Hopps put together a retrospective of Duchamp at the Pasadena Art Museum. It was the first show of the artist in America at the time, and it was the catalog for the show. Of course, I'm much more interested in the catalog. The catalog for the show was innovative because instead of writing a long text, Walter Hopps simply put down the scraps of his notes, and they reproduced those into the catalog, and they made a acetate cover with Duchamp designed the cover, and it's listed in the catalog raisonné as a piece.
Mm-hmm. And he also made a famous lecture there, when he went to...
Oh, yeah, the chess piece with wait, her name just went out of my head. She just died. Eve Babbitts, exactly.
But what's also interesting when you look at those two postures at the same time, is that they kind of show different sides of what LA was at one moment. So there's even though it wasn't a sort of advocacy gesture, but it's a very political gesture. And then when you see this, there is a sort of humor and fun that was very important. If you look, these were artists who were having a lot of fun. And one of the things that fascinated me when I met Joseph Kosuth and I saw his portrait that Warhol did in '65, and he started telling me about all these women he dated and how he partied all night. And for me, Joseph Kosuth, who got a show, a year later in LA, was a very dry, seeing from his work, very serious, very dry person. But on the other hand, actually, a lot of conceptual artists or early conceptual artists really had fun. Roche counts as a sort of conceptual artist, and he had fun.
You remind me, I should tell the story about the Kienholzes in the back. The works on the wall are called barter works. Ed discovered that from time to time he needed things when he was working. He needed a drill, he needed a chainsaw, he needed a variety of equipment. And then he had wants and needs. He wanted a Rolex watch. So he made these pictures. They were all the same. He signs them with a thumbprint, and he stencils in what he wants. So it might say Rolex. It might say hammer. But the interesting thing in the political comment, this is what you're talking about, is that all the pieces cost what they say they are. So if you wanted to go buy him a Rolex, you'd get the work of art that said Rolex. But if you wanted to spend $465, you gave him $465 and you got the same work of art, essentially. And it was a very subtle and funny way to comment on how collectors think about what they're buying. So do you buy the Rolex because it's clearly you had to pay a lot for it, or do you buy the $400 cheap version, which is essentially the same? So,
and I think this idea of fun is really important, because if you look at the poster of the Studs, it's a fun poster, presents as a public service. What public service? And the Studs, the way the letters are presented, it looks like it's almost a gig. It's a band, and so you're looking at a concert, basically an advertisement for a concert.
Well, also the image is of a lumberjack unloading hay, lumber from a cart, and it identifies those guys as super macho, and super masculine, which really was the way they present. I mean, look at Billy Al, the way they presented themselves.
But I think what LA had in '64, that's what David Hockney always says. When he arrived to LA as a young gay man, he understood that joyful sex was possible, which wasn't something that was that easy to experience as a young gay man
in England.
Yeah. And so there is that side, but then of course there is the other side of very masculine, men, and there is a sort of playfulness and sense of possibility that is quite striking. In a way, you could see the '60s in LA as a time for assertion, whereas the '70s and '80s will be much more a time for critique. I mean, if you look
That's right. Yeah, because isn't that when in the '80s was when Michael Ashurst started to teach.
In the mid '70s at CalArts, '73, I think. But in '73 he starts teaching at CalArts. Baldessari is teaching at CalArts, sending everybody to New York, and McCarthy starts making his very early videos. Burden makes the last performances, starts making sculpture in the late '70s. Then there is in the early '80s, the very early work of Mike Kelly. And so in a way, Larry Pittman starts making work which also addresses another layer of art, being both Latino and gay, which was something that wasn't included in the language of art. Artists like Simon Forti or again Barbara Smith make art, or Judy Chicago are in LA making art that makes a very strong political stance. And in a way, what we see here, and what I feel we see here, is a sense of joyfulness, but also a laying out of questions that will then be very important.
And also, one thing that we haven't talked about is that this era did ignore the black artists. I mean, David Hammonds was working there. Charles Gaines this is Los Angeles. We had David Hammonds, we had Charles Gaines, we had Fred Eversley, we had Ed. They just weren't recognized. They were busy recognizing Billy Al Bankston and Ed Ruscha, who were not so, what's the word? Just easier to acquire and collect and have to your cocktail parties.
That's true. And then it created space, but I think also it created a space for, I mean, I think in the case of David Hammons, there is something that is very traumatic about the experience of LA. The case of Charles Gaines is a little bit different because David Hammons came to LA, left LA, while Charles Gaines lives in LA and has been living in LA for forever.
I forgot Betty Saar, a black woman, finally, one woman.
And he kept making his work, which is at the same time extraordinarily, rich and colorful and theoretical, and his philosophical work, because Charles Gaines is also a practicing scholar of philosophy, like Adrian Piper is.
And music, right?
Yeah. And he's been making that work in that space, which only came to a very wide visibility a couple of years ago, really.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see that. I mean, that's a little bit later, but that will be. But what's interesting here is that you can see some very political questions, and some very performative questions, but raised with a form of playfulness.
Right.
While in the 70s, perhaps because of the impact of the Vietnam War, and then in the 80s with Reaganomics, which will be experienced in a very tough way in the LA art world. And then the AIDS crisis, which of course had a big impact on an artist like Larry Pittman. Then it starts sort of going into a different direction. But I think what's interesting also is that when we see this, there is a joyfulness, there is a sense of fun, but there isn't an innocence. And I think what's interesting is that we look at LA art, especially in Europe, even until Catherine Grenier's exhibition, as, it all started in the 80s. But when you look at the LA art world in the 60s, so much happened. And there were so many seeds of questions that were then to be relevant. And, that's actually a question I wanted to ask you, Dagny. Do you feel that the 60s are the real beginning of the LA art world as such?
Well, there's a whole different school of art there. There's the so-called LA plein air painters, which are entirely different. And these are traditional landscape painters. And they have a real, what's the word? They're in every collection. They're an important platform, but they were not, it's even hard to call them contemporary. But then there's also, remember in San Francisco, there was Richard Diebenkorn and Frank Lapdell and Wayne Thiebaud. There was a whole art scene going on in San Francisco at the same time.
And conceptualism.
Yeah, Bruce Conner and all. But because San Francisco and Los Angeles don't speak to each other, the two kinds of artworks really did stay separate, I think.
With a few bridges. I mean, Howard Fried shows in LA and lived in San Francisco. Paul McCarthy first goes to San Francisco, then to LA.
Richard Jackson too.
No, I mean, I think it's true that you have this. If you look at, you can't, if you want to name artists in the 50s in New York, artists in the 50s, you will find a wide number of very prominent figures. But in the 60s are literally, I mean, if you look at the artists were brought to the world by LA in the 60s, Andy Warhol, Marcel Duchamp, Joseph Kosuth, just name three. Then if you want to look at the artists who were working in LA and making their mark, Baldessari, Hockney, Vija Salmons, and Moses, Bob Irwin, Mary Kors, Barbara Smith, the list goes on, Keen Holtz, of course, the list goes on and on and on. So there's this very interesting thing that happens then, which is really the beginning of what will happen then. And I think we probably, and again, it's maybe because LA as a city is based on oblivion, its history is based on oblivion, which is normal for a city that one day will be destroyed.
Look
and
at
only,
LACMA.
Exactly, and it will only 100-year old really as a city, 120-year-old as a sort of architectural project. But really, you can see so many things in a history that hasn't yet, even though the Getty has done quite a lot of work for that, been fully accounted for.
I think it's a good time to go get a glass of wine.
Well, thank you, Dagny.
Thank you, Donatien. That was great.